All right, the bandage that we'll be demonstrating here is a SpicaSplint. So a SpicaSplint is one that is used for injury that is proximal to the elbow or proximal to the stifle. It's much more common for a SpicaSplint to be used on a forelimb, like we're going to demonstrate today, versus a hind limb, because you're dealing with the rectum, you're dealing with the prepuce in a male or the vulva in a female, and you have a lot more bandage complications. So we tend to not do them on the hind limb if we can avoid it. So this is going to be demonstrated on a forelimb, again, for an injury that's going to be somewhere within the humerus or the shoulder joint or within the scapula, somewhere proximal to that elbow joint. And the reason being is we have to stabilize that joint above and below the injury. And the only way to do that is to make a bandage that incorporates the trunk of the body. So this bandage is going to start at the toes, work its way all the way up the limb, and actually curve over the body. And we're going to do bandage 360 around the dog's trunk or chest. And that is going to provide the stabilization we need. Essentially, the splint is going to look like a candy cane. So the first thing that we have to do is do our primary layer. And our primary layer does not need tape. And the reason we don't have to do tape stirrups on this bandage is because the candy cane part of the splint that wraps over the body holds the bandage on, and it's going 360 degrees around the trunk. So there's no way for this bandage to slip. So you do not have to do tape stirrups on a SpicaSplint. So the first layer we're going to do is our cast padding. And you do cast padding up the limb and around the body. So what we're going to do is two separate sizes of cast padding. Cast padding comes actually in multiple sizes. There's even one that's smaller than this bottom one here. And so depending on the size dog, you can use different sizes of cast padding. It's very common for us to like this 3-inch cast padding because it's easier to work with and conforms easier. I really like this 6-inch cast padding when we're wrapping it around the trunk and doing our spicas. Or if you have a really, really large or giant breed dog, then it's easier to use this larger cast padding, but otherwise it can be very difficult to keep this uniformly flat on the dog if you're just doing it in a medium or large size. So I tend to stay away from the 6-inch unless I really need to use it. So we're going to have our assistant kind of hold the limb in extension, and we're going to then place the bandage or start our cast padding at the tip of the toes. Okay? Even if we're just trying to support a fracture above the elbow, we can't stop our bandage more proximal than this because we would create a constriction and we would have swelling of our limb. So we don't want to do that. So we start our bandage at the toes and we do a 50% overlap and we keep that bandage to where it's flat to the dog. So remember that when you're laying that bandage down, you have to be able to lay it down to where you have a flat angle and not have your bandage flipped where when you lay it down you have the whole roll touching the dog. Okay, so you lay it down flat on the dog and you do a 50% overlap, so angle yourself at about that 45 degrees as you're working your way up the leg, and you keep gentle but consistent tension to where you're pulling that cast padding to where it's getting snug and it's leveling out or getting all the bubbles out of it, but it's not tearing. Okay, you don't do it too tight or it will tear. If you do tear it like that, okay, super easy to tear, then you just start right back over where you're at. The difference now between a modified Robert Jones and this bandage is once you get to this point, we now need to start incorporating the proximal limb. So what I do, and it's not a set way that it's done every time, you can kind of follow a different pattern depending on how that cast padding is going. But essentially, we then bring it around the trunk of the dog, and I'll start by, it's naturally wanting to come to the back of the limb. So I'll come to the back of the limb, and I'll actually crisscross it medial into the axillary space and come to the cranial aspect of the limb, and then wrap it around again, and then come around the trunk of the dog, and then wrap it up caudal. So I have some bandage that's going caudal, in between, and cranial. okay? Now that I've got that, what I'm going to do is take this 6-inch layer, and I'm going to start, okay, wrapping my bandage around the proximal limb, okay, and then I'm going to come around the dog, and this bandage is going to want to stay caudal, so I'm just going to stay caudal. Then I'm going to wrap it around and come cranial on the dog, and then I'm going to wrap it around, and I'm going to go in between the legs and shoot back out cranial and wrap it around again like that. Okay, and then now this time stay caudal. So I'm kind of doing a combination of either wrapping around caudal, coming out cranial, or going in between the legs, so that basically I have bandage caudal, bandage going in between the limbs, and then I have bandage going cranial, okay, where you can see it cranial on the dog. So it's kind of a mishmash. It looks a little bit ugly, okay, but in order for you to get good confirmation of that bandage, you need to have it wrapped cranial and caudal. So I'm going to take this wrap and come back up the limb, and you're going to do this up the limb about 2 or 3 times, okay? And then as I'm coming up here, I'm actually going to tear this because I want to have it even everywhere. Now, to kind of make sure you have full coverage in the armpit area, what I like to do is actually lay the bandage wrap down, come into the armpit area, wrap around the limb, come back up, and cross over, okay? So it's kind of making sure that we have good bandage material padded in that armpit area. So we come up and cross back over, almost doing like a ribbon, okay, crossing on itself. Now we can take that gauze and go around the trunk, and then it's wanting to stay kind of caudal, so we'll go around and then we'll come out cranial on the trunk, okay? So we're going to do that multiple times so you get a nice thick bandage that's on, okay? And so when we're done with that part of the bandage, now what we're going to do is do our soft cling, okay, or our cling gauze. Now, like I described in a previous video with the modified Robert Jones, you can put the cling gauze on now and then put our splint on top of that, or you can put our splint on first and then put this cling gauze. So for here, I'm going to go ahead and put the cling gauze first to get good confirmation of this bandage. And that way you can see a different method of how it's done. 50% overlap, okay, of the soft cling, pulling on it to give some tension. When you get to that armpit or that axillary space, you're going to curve your bandage and wrap it around the dog. And if I wrapped caudal the first time, then I'm going to start wrapping it cranial to come back up the next time. And if I'm coming up cranial here and I run out, then I'm just going to pick right up where I left off and wrap it cranial. Okay, and then come caudal and come in between into the axillary space, wrap it back cranial. And then come caudal, kind of go in an X fashion like that. Okay, and then we're going to tuck this in so it doesn't go anywhere. So now that we've got our bandage on that has all of the cast padding on and it has the soft cling, okay, now we're going to put our splint on. And so in order to put the splint on, we're going to make one out of cast material. So to do so, you need to get a pair of gloves on and you need to have access to a sink or a bowl of water. So first off, after we have our gloves on, we're going to use casting tape. Now, casting tape comes in different sizes. This is a 3-inch casting tape. It can come in 2-inch, 4-inch, 6-inch. So depending on the size of dog, okay, if you want it to just fit on a lateral aspect of the limb, then you may get one that's smaller or larger, okay, than this one. So you can pick your size appropriately. When you open your package, okay, after you get it open, expose it to the air, we're going to get it in water. So it essentially looks like our soft cling gauze or our rolled cotton, okay? As soon as it's out, you get it in and you completely submerge it in the water. or you run it under the running water in the sink, which is generally what we do. Okay, and as you have it in the water, you're squeezing it so it gets and soaks into all the layers. Okay, and then you're going to do a squeegee action and get all of that excess water out. Okay, now with it wrung out, we're going to put the splint on. To put the splint on, we put it on laterally. Here, can you just come hold here? So it holds down, and then can you reach over and grab when I come? We're basically going to come touch the table on the other side, so we're almost touching the opposite shoulder blade, okay? And then we bring it back down the leg and fold it on itself. Just fold it up, and your assistant's going to hold it down, and you're going to unroll it again all the way to the opposite side, because you want to create that candy cane. So we're essentially creating a candy cane shape over the top of the dog to the opposite shoulder blade. Okay, and then coming back down. And generally, depending on the size of dog, you can do this 3 or 4 times with the amount of casting tape that you have. So you can see we went back and forth almost just about 4 times. And then you can start to conform it to the dog and kind of hold it. You have your assistant the entire time holding that bandage towards the table, because if you let go, it's going to spring back on you, and it's not going to provide that good candy cane shape that we need. So what I want to do is allow this to heat up and mold so that you can see what that candy cane shape looks like if I rotate this dog here in a minute. So we're going to let this set. And once it sets, then we're going to add another layer of that soft cling. But while it's setting, let's rotate, and you probably can let go now, Anna. So if you rotate the dog, and you can see how it goes all the way to the other side, okay? And it candy canes over the dorsum of the dog. So candy cane shape, okay? Or like one of those hooks that Bo Peep would have for her sheep, something of that nature, okay? You can see as it's getting sticky to me, that's why you want to wear gloves. Okay, so the assistant's going to hold that. Then we're going to hold this splint on and conform it to the dog, we have to put another layer of this soft cling. Okay, so just like we did our other layers, 50% overlap, work your way up the limb. Nice and even tension. I'm giving a little tug on the medial side and the lateral side as I'm wrapping around. And on this one, on this bandage, you don't have to get really crazy and do a whole nother massive layer of this. I just like to make sure that we have enough that it's incorporating completely our splint, so our splint doesn't get loose. Okay, so if we come around the dog, and come over again, and then come cranial, and go between the armpit, or the axillary space, and come caudal, then that should be enough. Okay, and if you have excess, you can just cut it. Okay, so now we have a dog that cannot move any portion of that forelimb. That entire forelimb is stuck in that one straight position, okay, because of that splint that's on. Now, one last thing we have to do is our final layer, which is the vet wrap. So, like previous videos, the vet wrap, okay, comes as a tight roll, and you want to make it not tight, because as you're unraveling it on the dog, you can have a tendency to get too tight with your wrapping and create constriction. So, you want to take your roll, and you're going to unravel it the whole way, the whole length of the roll, and then you're just going to roll it back on itself. You want to unravel most of it? So when you roll it back on itself, then it's going to look like so, where it's very loose wrapping. Now we can take that vet wrap, lay it down, and again, you're going to leave about 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch of the previous layers exposed. Don't go past the previous layers. You provide a little tension, wrap that vet wrap around, maintain that consistent tension, 50% overlap up the limb. Keep any little wrinkles out of the bandage if you can. And again, don't pull it too tight where it straightens out and you lose any of that bubble conformity, because then that means you're going too tight. So just a gentle tension so you're not pulling on that bandage. When you get into that axillary space, you can turn your bandage to go around the dog. And if you didn't undo it all the way, you can keep undoing it a little bit further as we go. And this bandage always looks a little ugly as you're trying to do it, because you're trying to kind of make it go in all different directions to cover all of the exposed underlying layers. And that's okay. So we're going to completely come caudal. Then we're going to come into the axillary space and come cranial. And come straight cranial again. And then come caudal. Okay, now if you have like a little triangle like we see here laterally over the shoulder, that's an easy fix. Okay, you can just take your vet wrap and come across it like so. Okay, to cover it. If you're worried about another layer, or any exposed, you can just continue your vet wrap, in any direction that you need to get full coverage of your bandage. Okay. That'll be good. And you see my assistant holding up the dog. It's not a joke. Oftentimes when we have dogs under anesthesia, we're playing that game light as a feather, stiff as a board. We're joking around that we have 3 or 4 people hovering the dog in the air so that we can wrap that bandage around the body. So you get the bandage completely wrapped around, so it's all the way around the dog's trunk, okay? And then that limb is not going anywhere. You cannot physically move that limb in any direction. And that is a SpicaSplint.